end poverty. That is the slogan of the IMF and World Bank. They emblazon it on their headquarters that's located in Washington, D.C. These two institutions are probably some of the most important financial institutions in the world. They were created in 1944 by the U.S. government and their allies in the wake of World War II. They are the pillars of the Bretton Woods monetary order. They were created to be the international lender of last resort for the world economy and to be the development bank that would fund projects in war-torn countries that private capital didn't want to fund. Sounds reasonable. Sounds like it could even work on a sound money standard. You know, sounds like something we might have in the future. Unfortunately, that's not what they ended up becoming. And, you know, when I started to look at the IMF and World Bank, I started to have questions. They claim that they want to help people, but their history is littered with essentially backing the world's worst dictators. And that, as a human rights activist, made me very, very curious. This is General Joseph Mobutu in 1973 in the White House with Richard Nixon. Mobutu was one of the world's most brutal tyrants. He starved his people and caused immense suffering. He assassinated his critics, he assassinated students, he assassinated protesters, and yet here he was in the White House at the beginning of what is known as a structural adjustment loan. In 1972, the IMF started dispersing funds to what was then called Zaire. Zaire is a country that is in the heart of the African continent. Zaire is so rich in mineral resources that I would not be surprised if it was the inspiration for the idea of the mythical place of Wakanda. It has every single possible mineral that goes into all of our technology today, whether it's uranium, tantalum, cobalt, you name it. It is so incredibly rich in labor, in natural resources, in mineral resources, and yet it has been completely ransacked. And unfortunately, the IMF has played a large role in this. Again, they want us to think they're there to help, but they're not. And the proof is really in the results. When the IMF structural adjustment loan program began in the early 70s, the currency of Zaire was worth $1. This is the Zaire. It was actually worth $1 in the early 70s. By the time $2 billion of structural adjustment loans had been dispensed to Zaire by the mid-90s, one Zaire was worth 1/1,000,000th of a dollar. So that was like the structural adjustment loans from the IMF squeezing the productive capacity out of this economy. So again, the question, ladies and gentlemen, is if the IMF and World Bank are designed to help, why do they bail out so many brutal and corrupt dictators? The thing is, there's been a lot of criticism of the IMF and the World Bank over the years, some from the leftist side, Marxist side, some from the libertarian side. And they do say, and they have said, that these institutions are bad for poor countries. And I think that's true. But I think what they miss is that they also deliver enormous benefits to us in the West. This is a newspaper article from the New York Times in 1978. And this is pretty clear and pretty plain about what was going on. Zaire agrees to control by IMF in return for economic assistance. The accord, which would allow the IMF to take effective control of the Zairean economy. So, you know, what you're seeing here is that the IMF and World Bank are not altruistic organizations. They're there to take control. They're there to excavate and harvest resources and cheap labor so that we can have a higher standard of life in our countries. It's a painful reality, but it's a reality that I feel like we cannot ignore and must guide our future decision-making as we start to create the new world economy. This is a depiction, a cartoon of what is actually happening. Again, we think that we are being charitable. We think that these lending institutions, these IFIs, we think that these large, global, enormous titans are helping these poor countries by giving them money, by bailing them out. But in reality, they are predatory lenders, okay? And to get into this, you have to understand that what they disperse to countries are not gifts, they are loans. And they are often very high interest rate loans. So just like on a 30-year mortgage, you understand that you end up paying back a lot more than what you originally borrow, right? You pay principal plus interest. So consider that when these poor countries take out a loan, and it's almost always a dictator or an unaccountable ruler who takes out the loan, right? It's usually someone who has no consent of the people. So this person, whether it's Mobutu, or whether it's Suharto in Indonesia, or Marcos in the Philippines, or Portillo in Mexico, you name it, As one book said, the IMF rarely met a dictator it didn't like. And again, those are for obvious reasons. The IMF and World Bank would prefer to work with dictators because they can just sort of get the job done and squeeze austerity onto these countries. Democracies, there's protests, there's Supreme Courts, there's like checks and balances, independent media. They don't like that. They would rather just work with like a military guy who could just like implement the reforms, squeeze the country, make cheaper exports for us, and get those minerals and resources out of there as quickly as possible. But what ends up happening is the debt trap that these countries fall into is so insurmountable. Here's like a structure of what a World Bank loan would look like, for example. And these things get like delayed and restructured for decades and decades and decades through something called the Paris Club. But that little black line is like the capital flow, basically. And of course, when you first take out a loan, yeah, great, you have like a bunch of money. But then as the years go by and you're paying back P&I and there's high interest rates, the flow starts to go in the other direction. So after several decades, you're totally in the red. This is a staggering chart of the external debt of poor countries, and we can refer to them as the third world, the global south, emerging markets, developing world. What I really mean are the people outside of what are known as the golden billion, which is the people who live in the United States, Europe, Japan, and some of our allies. The people who live outside of this area, the periphery of the world, have encountered an absolutely staggering increase in debt and credit. And basically, by the 1970s, the people extending this stuff knew that this could never possibly be paid back. Like the average middle-sized global south country owed about $100 million in external debt in the early 70s at the beginning of the fiat system. Today, they owe $100 billion. I mean, there's no possible way you could pay this back unless you have more debt. It's actually a literal Ponzi scheme. And what happens is this is done over time through what are known as standby agreements. So each loan comes in. This is a picture of another country, Ghana. So you see there's been 17 different loans, 17 different structural adjustments in Ghana. So Ghana's currency also has been like devalued and devalued and devalued so that it's just a tiny microfraction of what it was once worth. And again, the reason for doing that is so we can get the stuff that they make cheaper. That's basically why we do it, right? So if you look at this country's been structurally adjusted 17 times, and they're about to be structurally adjusted for the 18th time. They're in a big pickle right now because, as the US government has done recently, they've raised the interest rates and raised the cost to capital in a really staggering, historic way. So all of this debt that Ghana owed is dollar denominated, and all of a sudden they can't afford it anymore. It's the same thing that happened in the early 80s that caused the third world debt crisis and caused the suffering of tens and hundreds of millions of people. History is rhyming. It's repeating itself. You're seeing this over and over again right now. There are IMF structural adjustments in Egypt and Ghana and Argentina and all over. And that's why I think this talk and this conversation is so timely and so important. Your eyes should not glaze over when you read about this stuff. You should actually look at what is happening. And this is structural adjustment. This is examples of like what these countries have to do to take the money. So it might be currency devaluation, it might be raising taxes, it might be cutting all subsidies on food and energy, it might be something like restrictions on healthcare and education. And look, as a classic liberal type person, I'm skeptical that like subsidies of food and energy and medicine are maybe the right thing to do. But in a world where the rich countries do tons of subsidies and then the poor countries are prevented from doing any at all, it results in a completely unequal world. So for example, Britain has all this free healthcare, etc., yet it goes to little Sri Lanka and says you can't give any free rice to your people. And what happened again and again and again throughout the 80s and 90s was these countries which had like not great national healthcare education systems, certainly corrupt, inefficient, they went from having like not great to none at all, and people died. I mean, that's what happens. And the same thing can be said for petrol subsidies. And it's just so rich because, of course, Britain right now has a cap to energy prices. So rich countries would never accept the structural adjustment that they impose on poor countries. Even worse, there's something called a double loan. So this is an example of what happens when like a former colonial power like France gives 100 million euros to Ivory Coast, one of its former colonies. So the $100 million goes through an IFI, probably like the IMF, maybe the World Bank for an infrastructure project, right? And then what happens is like immediately the Ivory Coast hires French firms to do the work. So the money goes right back. Okay, so the money now is like back into the French economy. They are paid back. And then the Ivorians now owe principal plus interest. So for development, for helping the Ivorians, the French make 150 million euros. This is a double loan, and this is really kind of like indicative of most of the lending that happens around the world, you know, if not today, then certainly throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, through the formative period of how the Global South, you know, grew and came to be. This was most obvious to me when I was looking at the history of West and Central Africa and what is known as the colonial franc. This is something that people there still use. They still use a currency controlled by the French government in 14 countries in Central and West Africa. And the French would work with the IMF to devalue the currency. So overnight in 1994, for example, this Washington Post article mentions that you know, the value of the CFA was cut in half overnight. And again, this is to crack the whip. This is to make exports more competitive at the expense of the standards of living of people who live in those countries. So you have to consider that 6.7 billion people and most of the planet's resources, like most of the planet's fossil fuels, gold, timber, all that stuff that we need in our lives, come from the developing world. So here's a thought experiment. In 2015, it was estimated that a third of the labor and 50% of the resources that we consume in countries like the United States come from poorer countries. Now imagine if tomorrow we just didn't have that stuff. Imagine if 50% of the resources we used and a third of the cheapest labor on the labor spectrum was just gone. What would we have? We would have massive inflation. And that's really what these policies, this lending, this debt sort of imperialism is meant to do. It's to prevent inflation here at home. Like what this chart is showing you is the net resource transfer from the developing world to the rich world. And I'll explain what's happening here. But you have to consider, what was colonialism all about? Old school imperialism. It was about the conquistadors going to steal some gold. It was about Britain looting India. It was about going to places far away and stealing or looting or exploiting or getting for very cheap labor and resources so that the core countries could develop faster and could develop in a way you know, where you would see these like impressive civilizations. So what you're watching in the black line here is the net resource transfer per year, starts in the 80s. In 1982, you can see it goes negative. So since then, the poor world has been subsidizing our way of life. Today, that flow is in the trillions of dollars a year. This is all things, investment, remittances, grants, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is another way of looking at the post-colonial drain. So basically, like what the world figured out is that colonialism was like not appropriate, so we replaced it with something called debt colonialism, and we've been able to drain all that resources out a different way. We replaced the gun and the warship and the bayonet with debt. Now, what do we do you know, when we do debt colonialism? Well, we do resource extraction. Again, we do massive mineral harvesting, and most of this stuff is like, these countries will get money for an infrastructure project to build a mine and a train and a port just to get the mineral out of the ground with no benefits accruing to the local people. So these development grants are often to build infrastructure to help get resources out of that country without benefiting anybody inside. And beyond just the cheap resources and the interest and the cheap labor, there's also something else that's very important that we get out of structural adjustment, that we get out of this whole process as wealthy countries. We get to engineer the poor countries to be dependent on us. So don't just remember this. If you get one takeaway, it's not just that the IMF loans are malicious and bad for the poor countries, it's also that they're incredibly beneficial for us in this system. So for example, in the example of Bangladesh, this is a country where IMF loans and World Bank loans have encouraged the leaders to do what's known as shrimp farming or aquaculture. So instead of like growing cattle, rice, food that is meant for consumption, the country has been engineered to deliver food that is meant for us to consume. So they make shrimp that we eat. They don't eat the shrimp, we eat it, right? And this is in line with like the entire philosophy of the strategy is to take advantage of the fact that we issue the reserve currency of the world and they don't. So like when Bangladesh wants to buy tractors or fertilizer or oil, it can't print its own currency to do that. It needs to get dollars to do that in the current system. So if it tries to print its own currency and buy dollars, it's going to have massive inflation. So what they do is they export stuff in exchange for dollars to rich countries or dollar substitutes like euros, and then they can buy oil. So all these countries across the world have had to change their economies to get dollars to pay debt and to buy weapons and to pay off interest, instead of enriching themselves and making themselves more sovereign and independent. That is what has happened. And this just keeps growing and growing and growing and growing. This is the debt percentage of GDP of developing economies. I mean, this is a chart that belongs on WTFhappened-in-1971.com. I mean, I really think this is a symptom of the fiat age. And if you look at what happened in China, the CCP has been trying to copy this. And they're even worse. They charge even higher interest rates. Now, they've been encountering problems because they don't mint the reserve currency. So when a country defaults, they actually have like a dilemma. Do they like seize collateral? Do they take over a telecom? You know, they have problems, which is good. I think it's not great that the CCP, of course, is doing the same thing. But the point is they're not even able to be as successful. You can see like that their loans are like declining below what we're able to do through the bank and the fund. But the point is that all these different world powers are going to try and repeat this debt colonialism strategy because it's very effective. And if anybody stands up against them, there's problems. This is Thomas Sankara. He was the leader of Burkina Faso in the 1980s. He gave a speech in front of all the other African nations saying we shouldn't pay back our debt, especially the colonial debt that we didn't borrow. He was killed a few months later, and he was replaced by this guy. In fact, this guy, Compaoré, killed him. And now Compaoré became a very, very loyal borrower and client of the IMF and World Bank. This is him with Dominique Strauss-Kahn, the head of the IMF. So, you know, this is a grim subject. I understand that it's tough to comprehend that our success in the West, yes, it is because of free speech, property rights, foundational American values, foundational, classic liberal values, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, all of the things that make us successful. Some of that does come from the things that we should be proud of. And I think that's well known. I think that's well known if you study like traditional texts that look at why do nations fail, why do some succeed. But what we need to recognize is that it's also because we stole a lot of labor and resources from poor countries for a very long time. And people don't like to acknowledge that. It's a very difficult thing to acknowledge. But you know what? There is some hope on the horizon. There's something interesting. There's a disturbance in the force. There's Bitcoin adoption and cryptocurrency adoption. So what's interesting is here you're looking at a chart of adoption around the world, internet users aged 16 to 64 who own Bitcoin or some kind of cryptocurrency. And you can see that the worldwide average is around 10%. But the countries that have been adjusted the hardest, like Thailand, Nigeria, Philippines, South Africa, Argentina, Indonesia, Brazil, I mean, they have much, 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 much higher adoption rates. So people are escaping, and that's really interesting. And this is accelerating. So look at just what happened just even in the last year. I mean, some of these countries are now almost at 30, 25, 30% adoption of mainly Bitcoin and stablecoins. Like, people are getting out. If you were being structurally adjusted in Peru in the 1980s, you had no escape. Like, you had your fiat currency and it was devaluing and your banking sector was collapsing and there was really nothing you could do. And you had to deal with it. And look, they did deal with it. And a lot of people died, but a lot of people survived. And they have a lot of important lessons maybe for us as our system starts to come under stress. You have to understand that the colonial drain, when it breaks down, it causes big problems here. The Great Depression was in part caused by the fact that the British were unable to loot India at the pace they were before. The inflationary crisis in the 70s had to do with the fact that we lost control over energy production, and the people who now own that energy decided to raise the prices. Some of the friction and problems we're facing now has to do with globalization breaking down. But I think we need to wonder about what would the world look like if we had one neutral currency that was open to everybody. What would the labor markets look like if we had one neutral currency? If you couldn't kind of just like segment some people over here and squeeze them and squeeze these people and squeeze these people and squeeze these people. What if we were all just on the same currency standard? It wouldn't solve everything, but I think it would be pretty amazing. And honestly, like, if this thing keeps happening, if this movement keeps growing, if what all of you do every day, if you keep doing it, we're going to get closer to that goal. I'm not messing around. I think this is actually happening. So you have to remember, just to close, structural adjustment has been escapable. Tens of millions have perished. No one will ever be held accountable. Larry Summers is in the White House. He's on Twitter telling us what to do. You know, he's not going to suffer anything. The Ponzi will continue to grow. But finally, people have an escape. They have a plan B. Now, what can you do? The last two things you can do, I talk a lot about this in my book. I'd encourage you to check it out, Hidden Repression. And then if you want to join the resistance, you can meet the Bitcoiners who are growing circular economies and who are fighting back across the developing world at the Oslo Freedom Forum. So I'd encourage you to pick up Hidden Repression, maybe join us at the Oslo Freedom Forum. Thank you for coming to Bitcoin Miami. I'll see you later. Take care.
Bitcoiners, welcome back. We are at the Bitcoin Magazine live desk presented by Marathon. Slight adjustment to the panel, back with Zuby and Anthony, but we're tapping in Alan Helm. I love this conversation. You know, really what Bitcoin is about.
You just cut the weighted average age by about 20 years.
You know, hey, we got the youth in the building. You know, one of my favorite things about Bitcoin is that it really opens our eyes up to how the existing system works. I think a lot of people, they're comfortable with how it works, and they don't necessarily question, what's the IMF doing? What are all these different institutions doing, and how are they helping us? Alex digs into all of this in his conversation, in his book. Gentlemen, let's start with you, Zubi. You know, you spoke about truth as being something that is lost on this current world. How does that kind of tie into what's happening with the IMF and what Alex has uncovered here?
Well, I think it absolutely ties in because the fiat money system it's fake, essentially. The whole thing is built on falsity and inauthenticity. And it's been like that our entire lives and for a couple decades before then. But I think for all our lives, there hasn't been an alternative, right? It's, you know, people can see the problem with the dollar, the euro, pounds, let alone going into some of the currencies in developing countries which just experience crazy inflation rates. I mean, we're here in the modern Western world talking about, you know, 5%, 8%, 10% inflation. You've got places where it's 50%, 100%, 5,000% inflation, right? Which means you cannot save money. You can't save money at all. And now we do have an alternative. There is a way to opt out of that system and to choose a better form of money, and that's why we've got Bitcoin.
It's wild to me, the stat that more money is leaving or being extracted from these countries that are receiving loans from the IMF, and more money is actually leaving those countries and going back to the originator countries. It seems like it's out of balance. More money is exiting the third world into the first world. There's something off with that. Anthony, I mean, how can that be?
Well, Alex is going to do a much better job of explaining it than me, but it's very simple. The people that are getting the loans have natural resources and corrupt governments. So what ends up happening is the cronies take the money, they steal a portion of the loans, the resources get sent to the other countries, and so there's a net trade deficit in those countries, which further cripples the economy and causes more devaluation. So it's a negative feedback loop for developing countries. And I think what Alex is basically saying, if you can decentralize the money, take the trust away from the policymaker and the politician, the money gets harder, and then the middle-class people, the lower-middle-class people, they get to save their money. They don't have that anxiety of the 5,000% inflation. Just one thing about human nature, we devalue. Human nature leads to devaluation because what happens is whether they're autocracies or democracies, they overpromise the electorate what they can do. They can't afford what they can do, so they have to start monetizing their debts.
Alan, how does Bitcoin fix this?
Bitcoin absolutely fixes this. As Anthony was saying, humans are naturally born to devalue. We have a soft money that has avalanched over time. And with Bitcoin, you know, we have a hard monetary asset that can be used and spread throughout the world. And it greatly incentivizes a lower time preference. That transpires not just from our money, but to the decisions that we make on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, it's hard to think that anyone living in a country that has the kind of devaluation that many of the countries that are working with the IMF are experiencing, that it's their fault that they're in the position that they're in. Hopefully, Bitcoin can bring zero inflation money to everyone on the planet. That's something that this planet has never had, and I'm really optimistic for it.
Thank you, Miami, for the last 3 years in this amazing city. The whole world shut down, but Miami welcomed us with open arms. We want to show Bitcoin to the whole world. We are taking the conference on the road to set the stage for Bitcoin in a new city. Nashville. Bitcoin 2024 is coming to Nashville in Tennessee, a city that is known as a music and freedom city. Bitcoin 2024 in Nashville from July 25th to 27th.